So, welcome to this second lecture in the course which we call The Nature of Our Night Consciousness. It's just so exciting, I think, to reflect on the fact that we live what we talk about. We do that all the time, of course. But right now we are trying to stage a course, and there is lots of work backstage and lots of cables. I think in 20 or 30 years, when they look back on us, they will laugh at all our cables and our primitive technology. But it's what we have right now, and we are able to meet anyway. But also in everyday life, thinking of your lecture, and we try to plan our lives and we perhaps careers and everything, and then things don't always turn out the way we want to. And then we think, well, what's wrong with this play? I didn't want a boss, for example, to be in this room where we're going to have a course, and all sorts of things where we don't really understand why is this happening in my play when I didn't want it to happen. And that's why it's so interesting to reflect on life as a theater, as you said, Bob, yesterday. But I'll try to say something about what Martinus calls our night consciousness right now. And it's a huge topic. But he says basically that we exist in two worlds. We experience right now, we experience in two different ways as long as we live on the physical plane, he says. And in a way, I think we experience two worlds right now because I see an electronic world and I also see a physical world here in the blue room where I sit. But Martinus also says we have a completely spiritual world where we experience, and we do that at night and between our incarnations. But it's a real world. And some of them come along to us in the forms of dreams, and they are not as such, he says, at least they are usually not true events or dreams, but they mirror, they give us some kind of picture of what we actually can experience on the spiritual plane. But thinking about that, I just wanted to show you this picture. In Swedish, we say the top of an iceberg, and no, it's the tip of an iceberg, but the image is at least the same. We see an iceberg, and this picture is taken from Wikipedia, and it's a photo montage, you say. It's a constructed picture. You can't photograph this. When an artist has imagined, if you have an iceberg that's as small or big or huge as this is, then just imagine how big this iceberg is beneath the surface. And of course, we are able to not to photograph this, but we can investigate this. And many people have used this as an image, also Martinus, to describe when we see something, but it's just a little part of it, a little part of everything that we can see. And if we compare that to our own selves, we could say that what we see right now, what I see, I see the people in the study room, and I see Jeff and Michael and myself. That's the top of the iceberg, and we can tell something about our lives. We can tell about our age and what we look like, what we like. I can tell you I've been married, I've been divorced, I have 2 children, I like to read books. And it would just be the top of the iceberg of all the things that we all have experienced, all the talents that we have trained, all the relations that we have had, perhaps also with each other, here and now, if you don't remember it. So we can read nature in that sense as a book of life, but we are more than we see. And if we compare this very briefly to what we call the unconscious in psychology, which I'm not an expert of, I'm not a psychologist. Let's see, so somebody wrote something in the chat. Yes, I'm recording in the other room, I hope. If we compare Martinus's concept of night consciousness, which I think is his unique consciousness. I'll come back to the exact analysis. But if we compare that to what we could call, what they do call the unconscious, or perhaps the subconscious, but let's stick to the unconscious. In psychology, the way I understand it, in Martinus' definition of our night consciousness is much, it encompasses so much more. But of course, he reckons with many lives. And normally in normal psychology, you would perhaps say that our unconscious, here you find many things such as drifts, instinctual drifts, perhaps childhood memories, perhaps also some repressed trauma memories, things like that, which you can talk to with a psychologist and get help by analyzing those. But if you compare that to Martinus's view of what's beneath the iceberg, then you will find not just one life's hidden memories, so to speak. You will find all our previous existence, and in this case, very much our earthly lives and everything we have experienced and learned in our earthly lives. I also would say, the way I understand, so to speak, more normal or mainstream psychology, that our unconscious could have a slightly negative bias. That yes, you're influenced by your unconscious and you don't know it, and it makes you do things and you have no control over it. Whereas if you look at it from a cosmological point of view, our night consciousness is a huge resource, a positive force, many things that we have access to and that we actually can get in contact with when we sleep. For example, if we take a very concrete example, like preparing a lecture or writing a book or any projects that you might have, you might think about those projects during the night and actually get in real contact with earlier talents, other people or other beings, light beings, angels, that can give you inspiration and power and ideas so that you can continue the next day and have fresh views on whatever you would like to do. So in that sense, I think night consciousness it's invisible, but it's real, and it's much more positive than what we would normally think when we talk about the unconscious. Right. Why does he call it the night consciousness then? He actually says that it's, in a way, our primary consciousness. So we need to think clearly what he means. But he says we don't experience it as real and live right now. And when he describes our dreams and things we might remember from our night, they don't seem real. They might seem absurd and vague. So he refers to it as our night consciousness from this perspective, because it's here and now where we learn to think. It's in this theater of life or school of life where we actually think clearly, perceive clearly, most often at least. And this is where we have our day consciousness. And during our when we are awake during daytime, this day consciousness is connected to our physical brain. It's not the same as our physical brain. It's like a radio, what you call a radio transistor emitter. It's our thoughts and feelings do not consist of our physical brain, but it's important when we are awake. Our physical brain is, of course, very important for us to receive our thought impulses from our superconsciousness. So he calls this night consciousness because from this perspective, it is not as real. But further on or later on, he says that it will be the most real consciousness that we have. And sometimes here in our lectures in Klint, we refer to near-death experiences. They have become very common and people talk about them also in mainstream media. And I have noted that many people who have had a near-death experience, they really describe those two worlds that Martinus tells about, because they say everything was so much more real. even if time and space don't exist. But everything is so much more real in that sphere of existence. But when they come back, they need to describe things in another way where time and space exist, because it does. And it's sort of two worlds, and they often say that they have difficulties in describing what life is actually like on the other side, the way they have experienced it. So in that sense, we might get some help from them, from those near-death experiences, to realize that this night consciousness is really the primary consciousness. Martinus also says we are lucky that we don't remember it, and lucky that we don't experience this as clearly as we do during our day consciousness, because we talked about difficult fates in our dialogue after Anne's lecture, and he really says if we would remember all the fantastic experiences we have during our night, it would be so even more difficult to endure all the hardships and all the difficult things we have to go through during daytime. So we can wake up with a sense of relief and happiness when we sleep well. But it's good that we don't remember everything about it, because then perhaps the difficulties that we remember when we get up would be so much more difficult. So let's move on then, or move back. Let's see if I can find the next slide as elegantly as Anne could. We have the topic life as a theatre, so I just thought, since this is a course in English, that I would like to refer to perhaps the greatest of all English-speaking dramatists, even if there are many. But we have Shakespeare, and I certainly think he had many cosmic or small cosmic glimpses, or at least a cosmic inspiration when he wrote his plays, because they still touch us 400 years later, and even if psychology wasn't invented at the time. But this is a famous line from As You Like It, where he actually says, all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances. And in a way, I think that relates so well to what Anne told us about Martinus's description of life as a theatre in the earlier lecture, that everything is actually a stage, the world as we perceive it, the physical world. And we, men and women, human beings, also other beings, of course, but human beings, we are just players. We have our exits and we have our entrances. And of course, then we go in again, and here you see the globe. I have visited it together with my partner Lars in London. This is where they have built up the globe as it looked like, and you see it's outside, and you really see all the rows that Anne talked about. We have the audience. They're not here right now, but the audience would sit here or stand up. That was the cheapest ticket. You could just stand, and here we have the actual players playing around on the stage. And since they didn't have much, what's it called? They didn't have many tools or things. So they just have to show with words and with their art that they were in Greek at midnight, for example. And everyone was sort of taking part in the game. And then, of course, we have our backstage as well. But we have exits and entrances on the stage. We have a little role to play, and then we have to exit again. And that's, Martinus would say, is the same as entering into day consciousness and exiting again into our night consciousness. And he talks about night consciousness, as you say, when we sleep, but very much also he talks about it in connection to our time between our earthly lives, as when we die. So he says here in a quote, when we die, we leave the stage for a time and go into our night conscious world, which, in this connection, can be likened to that world which, in the ordinary earthly theatre, is found backstage. And we talked about how many people are actually involved in making an opera or a theatre or a film work, but also, of course, it's extremely complicated machinery, as we see here, but could also perhaps be be compared to our physical brain, but also to what Martinus calls our spiritual brain, which is really, really complicated, a complicated spiritual structure. And he goes on, here, backstage, we have a world with stage hands, stage electricians, dressers, stage managers, or whatever these helpers might be called, who are invisible from the auditorium, but whose help is absolutely essential so that the play on stage can proceed. And actually, I think it's quite touching. That's why I chose a picture with lights, because Sue mentioned our guardian angels, and we talked a lot about angels in our last course, but we can imagine how many angels we always have around us. They are helping us right now with this course, standing behind every one of us, but they are helping also the Whitsun retreat at the terrace, but they are helping everyone. And I think it's just us, ourselves, that just forget, at least I do, tend to forget to be grateful to all the helpers that we have and to turn to them when you feel that you need their help, because all they want to do is to help us. And we have the different helpers, different guardian angels. Some might be disconnected human beings wanting to help their children or other people still living on earth, and some might be permanent guardian angels who belong to the real human kingdom. And then we have those other helpers who actually help all of humanity, who decide who is going to rule, who decide when Putin is in power and when he's not going to be in power. All those people, all those beings are also helpers. In the play that we might think, it's like the players on stage would forget all the helpers backstage and believe that they can handle the lights and everything themselves. In a physical world, we know that without the helpers, the scene would be dark and they wouldn't hear the speakers, and we wouldn't have an audience or all the things that are necessary in order to organize a play. And of course, it's the same, but we are not aware of all the spiritual helpers that we have. So again, it's fantastic to remember that all the time. Martinus says we live in two dimensions. We have our physical world and we have the invisible world. And I also think it's interesting when we think about our article lives, fate, drama, to remember that we have our individual plays, but we also have a common play, of course. We play together. We play different roles in each other's lives, and we do that all the time. So many helpers, and we can't see them all. But Martinus gives us some, as he does, some visual aid, some help in order to understand how this really works. And Anne went through symbol number 6 that you all know, and she talked about the Martinus description of the I and the super consciousness, and then what Martinus does. I don't really know if you see my marker right now, but what Martinus does is, you do, yeah. Is that he divides, or he distinguishes between two kinds of consciousness in our created world in X3. So he says we have the day consciousness, which you could sort of, which is connected to our physical body, which you see here in our body of gravity. That's the day consciousness, and it's also our night consciousness. So both of them are part of what Martinus called the subconscious. Here we need to separate Martinus' definition of subconscious to the word in the way it's used in psychology. So we could compare the night consciousness to the unconscious, but subconscious has a different meaning in Martinus. It's everything here belonging to the created world. And then we have our eternal structures, the X2. And then he has this second symbol, a parallel to symbol number 6, symbol number 90, where he shows actually our night consciousness. And as you see here very clearly, he's very pedagogical. he sees that here we have the orange body, the body of gravity, our physical body, our day consciousness. And here we have fallen asleep, or we have died. Says there is no death, but it's very real to us, at least, that people pass away through another plane of existence. And then our consciousness is carried by our body of feeling. And some angel just moved on to the next picture. So we'll just read the quote here. The symbol shows, and it's symbol number 9, shows how the day consciousness has been transferred to the body of feeling, yellow color. Earlier, it was the orange-colored body that carried the physical day consciousness. Now it is the night consciousness, i.e., that is the body of feeling that carries our consciousness. And of course, that might seem strange to us at first, and you can really hear that when Martinus talks about this in his lectures. He tries to explain to us we have 6 bodies. We have several spiritual bodies. So if we lose our physical body, our consciousness automatically, in our case, is transferred to our body of feeling, which is what happens at night. Because we actually don't need to rest our consciousness. He says when we are tired, when we want to sleep, and rest and activity are 2 important parts of life. But it's just our body and our physical brain and our nervous system that need rest and need to be repaired. Human beings sleep a lot because we have a complex nervous system, complex structure. So when we sleep, and ideally we sleep soundly and don't dream. I dream a lot. So in that sense, I have a slightly disturbed connection probably between our 2 worlds, because I certainly remember lots of my dreams, but ideally Martinus says we shouldn't remember any dreams, because most of our dreams are just blurred memories of what we actually have experienced on the spiritual plane. And they could also be mixed with experiences on the physical plane. That's why we can dream that your son gets a boat and suddenly it's a plastic boat, or suddenly it's a real boat, and everything is just mixed. And those sorts of dreams, they're just sort of mixed up memories. And then there are a few dreams, Martinus says, that show us, that prove that a real spiritual world exists. And those dreams could be predictions of the future. I had actually a college who had a very, very strong and special prediction of a future event. And she wasn't spiritually oriented at all. I won't tell it now. I might tell it later on because I see time flies. But Martinus says a few of our dreams actually show us that what we experience during our night, is our real experiences. It's not just something that happens, that it hasn't got a real value. And he goes on again to say what we already know. The night consciousness is thus a state of experience in which the being finds itself when its physical body does not function, is at rest. And here we, of course, see a baby who has recently arrived in the physical world and sleeps a lot, still perhaps very much characterized by the state of bliss that the baby has been in before incarnation. But we also see a cat, and those of you who have had cats, I haven't, but my mother has had, can see that they often seem to make movements in their sleep. They might dream about catching mice or whatever they enjoy doing most of the time. So there are also other animals that sleep, and they do that in different ways. So every being on the physical plane, in the animal kingdom and in the at least in part of the human kingdom, needs sleep. And as I said, Martinus talks a lot about what we experience after death when he talks about night consciousness. And here he has a very interesting symbol, which I will just show you and not go through, but he shows, you see the black line here, it's what we call death. And then he shows you everything that different kinds of beings experience. And you could also actually compare it to what we can experience in our normal sleep during one night. we experience different things according to our spiritual structure, according to how developed our spiritual bodies are. So here to the left, if we start with a very, what he would call primitive human being, the most primitive actually experience things related to the energy of gravity and the energy of instinct, and that's also what they experienced in the spiritual world. Whereas the more developed you get, the more humane you get, you can follow the pole transformation here as well and see the more balanced our two pole gets, the more you can experience of the other realms. You can get inspiration from the real human kingdom in the spiritual world, and from the wisdom, the kingdom of wisdom, and also from the divine world in our journey through the spiritual worlds. Finally, then you would go back into new incarnation. And that could be a lecture in itself. So I just wanted to show you that Martinus really describes in many of his lectures and also in some of his symbol explanations how much and how different we experience in our night consciousness, depending on how developed our spiritual bodies are. Here he also says something about what is called purgatory, what we normally at least explain as purgatory, which would be the brown parts here. And it means that if you have a state of conflict in your mind when you die, you could have a part of a kind of a period of suffering when you die, and you experience loss and isolation and so on until you ask for help. And then you're released from that and can move on into more the real spiritual kingdoms, the real spiritual worlds. But also very briefly, I wanted just to say something about what role our night consciousness plays when we think. I was thinking of what we talked about before our break. What wishes do we have, and what do we long for, and what role does our night consciousness play in that process? And Martinus describes it in the following way: when a being thinks, and it's of course something that we do automatically and all the time and so quickly that it's difficult to understand that only in these 30 minutes every one of us is thinking thoughts all the time. But he says a force goes from our superconsciousness, the superconsciousness of the I, into the night consciousness of its subconsciousness. So we have three different consciousnesses here: superconsciousness, our superconsciousness, where all our talents are stored, all our earlier experiences are. And then it goes into the night consciousness first, into what we call our subconsciousness. And here in the created world, but to begin with, in our night consciousness, this force becomes a mental image, or an image of thought, as they say in Danish. And he goes on to describe what happens then. And from this night consciousness, what I'm not completely aware of then, this is transmitted to the day consciousness of the subconscious. So I hope you agree. It goes from the subconsciousness through our night consciousness back to our physical world, you could say. Because when we are not asleep, when the being is not asleep, our subconsciousness has its domicile in the physical brain, and it gets more concrete here. Then perhaps you see a child driving a bicycle, for example. Is that what you like? You really want to drive a bicycle? And then you have some thoughts, and perhaps you have a bicycle standing outside, and then the process could be very quick, that you have this impulse, perhaps beautiful weather, perhaps you see somebody else driving a bicycle, perhaps somebody says bicycle, and so this process starts. Well, I would very much like to drive my bicycle. It goes through your night consciousness into our awake mental subconscious, and then in day consciousness, and then it from our physical brain it can manifest itself, and we can move, grab our bicycle and go for a ride. So in Martinus's word, he says, here the thought goes on to become desire or will and gives rise to the manifestation and creation in the material world. And what's interesting and what we can reflect on is, of course, that our wishes and longings and actions, they are influenced by my night consciousness and the things that I'm not always aware of. And they just pass through that register, which means, of course, some of my actions, and we talked about and mentioned cosmic chemistry, if I'm not aware of all the things that I carry, then some of the actions or wishes or longings could be quite contradictory. And Martinus says we really need to understand that in order to have a fixed point, we need to understand the cosmic analysis, and we need to understand our own I, because otherwise, of course, since we have an animal part, for we have animal thought climates, as Martinus says, and we have our human thought climates. So our impulses could be somewhat contradictory if we don't understand the process of how our thoughts are formed. And here again, I just wanted to show you this symbol, which Martinus actually hasn't explained, but we sometimes show it because we think it's so fascinating. And it's called the eyes turning of the movement of the energy, symbol 98. And just because we know his color language, you could say, in his symbol language, we understand that whenever we get an impulse, you see a small arrow here. Whenever we get an impulse, if we start here from our created world, we could say from our physical world, could be something that I'm in Stockholm or something that Michael, for example, says to me or sends me an SMS, we ought to do this, or we really need now to get our compendium for our summer courses ready. And then, of course, that goes into my X2 area. It's passing, it's all I interpret his message, this impulse, through all my earlier experiences, and then something mysterious takes place here, the turning of the energy, the movement of the energy in the eye, and it's a kind of a birth of a new thought, Martinus says, and the new thought then comes out here to the left, the way we interpret the symbol anyway. So it go, and then it of course is formed and it's influenced by my X2 again, by what some things I hear and I just can't understand them. Some people are not interested in Martinus's analysis, but they don't have that kind of experience or questions yet. So those impulses just pass their X2 without having a certain manifestation in X3. But it could be that Michael sends me an SMS, I could interpret it in a certain way, and now my arrow has almost disappeared. And then it could be that I get a thought, it goes through my night consciousness, and finally I might send an SMS back. And how that SMS is formed depends then on many of the things that I might not be aware of. And that's interesting to reflect on, and that's all this backstage area. And these quotes are taken from a very good article called Superstition and Primitivity. And just to finish that line and to realize how important the power of thought is, I also just wanted to take this quote as well, and then I'm also coming to an end. At the same time, Martinus says, as this thought power vibrates into the physical brain and nerve system, it vibrates through different areas of the physical body, such as the blood, the musculature, the skeleton, the glands, and here constitutes a functioning power. And this power constitutes the being's life force. So this is, again, Martinus talks all the time about how important our thoughts are for our well-being. But we realize that parts of our thoughts are also this huge, huge thing that's beneath the iceberg. These are also parts of our thoughts, and these actually influence our well-being. It's part of the power that are our life force. So it's well worth studying in that sense. And we realize too, when we see this symbol, that we have a theatre play within our bodies as well, within our microcosmos. And that's one of Martinus's huge, part of his very, very important mission to teach us to be aware, become aware of our microcosmos as well, and the play in this sense that we have there. So just to wrap it up, coming back to the iceberg, I was inspired by Anne's quote from The Secret Chamber, also one of the articles that or these 2 articles that I come back to again and again and again. And I think they could sort of be related to this symbol number 22, because if we think of the iceberg that we do know, the part of the iceberg that we do know and the part that we don't know, we could compare it to the physical world, the way Martinus describes it here in symbol 22, and what he very often actually calls the real world, or the real existence, which we can see here above the black lines, which would be then the spiritual planes. And we are not aware of them, especially not we who live in the second part of the animal kingdom, and perhaps think that just one small incarnation is all there is. And we don't realize that we have this huge top of the mountain, and of course also this huge spiritual world with all the helpers, and with the Godhead that is prepared to help us all the time, and that we have actually never left, according to Martinus. It's just our journey, the part of the journey where we are right now, that we perhaps have forgotten that we are connected, that we actually are living within the Godhead, and that the door is always open. But we could sort of think of this as the top. This is the top of the mountain, and we can't see it at all when we live in this area that Martinus also calls our foster area. So that is it. And to just wrap it up with Shakespeare again, he says, "We are such stuff as dreams are made on." He refers to the characters in a play, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. And I think I should get that up. Yes, our physical life is rounded with the sleep, but there are many exciting things happening in that sleeping period, and certainly many, many things happening before we start our next play and our next life. So thank you for your attention.